We've already looked at some of the people who influenced sex education in Scotland. We had a sort of theatrical Satanist as anti-Christian imagery in his rock band. We've had various child sex advocates. On this video, we're going to look at the man at the top, the man in charge of the RSHP sex education resources in Scotland. So here we are on the RSHP website, the Scottish Government's official sex education resources. I noticed the Scottish Government and Education Scotland are just distancing themselves a little bit from it. It used to say they were involved in producing it, whereas it now says they advised on it. I wonder if our pressure is beginning to make them a bit uncomfortable. I mean, the videos we've made about this topic, they've been viewed more than 100,000 times in different contexts. So John Swinney and Education Scotland, they're still commending these resources. They're still the official Scottish Government's resources that they want to be used in all schools. And we see here in the contact Colin Morrison, who's the top man responsible for this project. Here he is in the photograph, third from the right. On the right, we've got the bloke from the quasi-Satanist band. So third one along from the right is Colin Morrison. Now he runs a little organisation called TASC, and they were given the project of producing these resources. I've actually done a Freedom of Information request to see how much the government paid to get these done. But anyway, Colin also on the TASC website has got his PhD thesis, which I think he did. I think it was 2011, Glasgow University, and it's about sex education for kids with learning difficulties. There's a link to that below. So I'm going to look at his dissertation and see what we can learn about Colin's values. Right at the very beginning of the introduction. As a young gay man growing up in the 70s and 80s, my politics were influenced by the failure of my own educational experience to recognise and validate my sexuality and sexual orientation. Further, they were informed by the women around me, by ideas and ways of life prompted by feminist thought, and the new sexual and identity politics which informed the culture and political struggles that engage me. So, first thing he needs to say is that he's gay and he's been inspired by women in particular, not men, women. So he's very much the die-hard feminist. I mean, you can see why he's got the job. I mean, this is like the perfect CV for Nicola Sturgeon. He is the perfect candidate. It says he's very much motivated by identity politics. The Scottish Family Party were completely against divisive identity politics, but he sees it as his driving force. And he sees this whole project as a part of a political struggle. So you assume the RSHP resources are part of that political struggle as well. And he admits that. Here, I mean, anyone who looks at the RSHP resources would know that already. It's there to further a political philosophy and a philosophy of sexuality. I mean, that's just obvious, but it makes it even clearer when you see this. Right, let's jump into the body of the text of his dissertation. Now, a lot of it is pretty unclear. It's quite opaque prose, but I'm trying to give it an honest interpretation. So stick with it. This video is not short, but stick with it, and it becomes clearer as we go along. Right, he says this. The historical perspective identified that sexuality is a social construct, and its expression by certain groups, including those with learning disabilities, has often been pathologized and controlled. So in this sort of academic era, everything's a social construct. Everything's just a concept created by society. So in his work here, he's saying sexuality is a social construct, childhood is a social construct, learning disability is a social construct. So if it's a concept just created by our society, that also implies that it's arbitrary and it can be changed. So he says sexuality has been pathologized and controlled for certain groups. So sexuality has been like treated as an illness, treated as a problem and controlled for certain groups. Implication, this is a bad thing. This shouldn't have been happening. I wonder who those groups are. Well, one group seems to be people with learning disabilities. I wonder which other groups have had their sexuality controlled and repressed. Well, let's carry on. A persistent problem is the exploration of sexuality, that is, its complexity is often misrepresented or ignored. This work has already identified that discussion and understanding of human sexuality is restricted when it simply means having sex. Right, well, I don't think anyone actually does think that sexuality just means having sex. But anyway, certainly when discussing sexuality in childhood, Jackson reminds us that childhood and sexuality are both established as special areas of life and so any meeting between the two is likely to be explosive. Yes, but again, he seems to be saying that this is just an arbitrary clash of social conventions. In order to protect those we view as vulnerable, where sexuality is indeed just having sex, Jackson recognizes the argument would be children and sex should be kept apart. Okay, but it means so wider sexuality with children is okay. It's just the having sex bit that there might be reasons to pull back from. In Chapter 3, it was possible to track similar emerging attitudes in terms of people with learning disabilities. Indeed, Rembis proposes that it's a consequence of oppression and control, the sex and disability remain incompatible. So sexuality was denied by oppression, and all this language is parallel. The obvious conclusion to draw there is he seems to be saying that denying children's sexuality is similarly a form of oppression. So what's he mean by sexuality? Well, he discusses that. It's not particularly clear, but he gives a definition. Seems to put quite a lot of weight on a definition from the World Health Organization. And it says sexuality is a central aspect of being human throughout life and encompasses sex, gender identities and roles, sexual orientation, eroticism, pleasure, intimacy and reproduction. Sexuality is experienced and expressed in thoughts, fantasies, desires, beliefs, attitudes, values, behaviors, practices, roles and relationships. So if you take out having sex, what does that leave? It leaves eroticism, sexual pleasure, romantic intimacy. Right, it goes on to say, it would seem that keeping childhood and sexuality apart has done little to help us explore what children and young people need to ensure a healthy and happy adult sexuality, because such a position fails to explore what sexuality means and why it matters in childhood. Okay, so child sexuality, there needs to be exploration, experimentation. Now at this point, let's just check what he means by a child. Because sometimes you're talking about children and young people, sometimes you just said children. So I thought I'd check what he meant. I tried to find a precise definition. I couldn't find one, but then I thought, hang on. Let's check the RSHP resource website and see what terminology he uses. And as I expected, he uses child for primary school, he uses young person for high school. So what he's talking about here is primary school age children. Right, we're on to section 4.2 of his dissertation, Childhood and Sexuality. Now he quotes an academic called Stevie Jackson, and I'm just going to read a bit about her before we go into his quote. Stevie Jackson's utopia is an egalitarian world without gender, where your genitals matter as little as your hair colour, a world where marriage is abolished and those who wish to commit to one another engage in civil partnerships. She advocates a collective model of child rearing and believes that heterosexual monogamous couples are not necessarily the best parents. So I think we can safely assume she's not going to be joining the Scottish Family Party. Anyway, so back to Colin. In considering childhood and sexuality, Stevie Jackson would have us return to the analysis of historical positions and understandings of sexuality that saw debates about what might be considered natural and unnatural. Jackson argues that whilst biology is a factor in all human sexuality, like all behaviours, the expression of sexuality is modified by social factors or the cultural norms, rules or boundaries of society. For Jackson, all the acts or aspects of biology we may be tempted to view as natural are socially constructed definitions of what is sexual, so it can be argued that given that culture, not nature, shapes the forms of our sexuality, it's clear that most of our sexual behaviour is learnt. So it's basically saying there that there's no such thing as natural and unnatural when it comes to sexuality. They're just social constructs. So if we look at the RSHP resources, for example, sorry to have to talk about this again. So that's why he thinks licking the anus is as natural and normal and healthy or whatever as heterosexual intercourse. It's mere social convention that people might think that licking the anus is disgusting. But that's his philosophy, and that's what the Scottish Government wants promoting to all children in Scotland. Anyway, let's look at what else he's got to say. However, as alluded to earlier, there remains a problem when discussing sexuality, and so sex and relationship learning, and childhood, because it requires us to understand the interface between the two in the context of a culture where the recognition of human sexuality in day-to-day life has become more and more disassociated from childhood. What has become embedded in our traditions is a view of the child as ignorant of all matters relating to sexuality. Childhood is understood, constructed, to be something separate from the realm of adulthood, and it is only in adulthood that sexuality can be understood and expressed. Not just understood, understood and expressed. In the construction of childhood, we have problematized sexuality per se. I mean, it's the Sanders story in these sort of academic circles. The idea is that all the bad ideas come from the Victorian times, and it's only since the 1960s that the sun of wisdom has been rising on humanity, and that enables us to see the way we ought to be heading. So that's why we see sexuality in childhood as incompatible, because that's a hangover from an earlier age. So remember what he's talking about here. He's talking about primary school children, and he's talking about sexual orientation, eroticism, sexual pleasure, romantic intimacy, by the definition that he's using. What's being created, it would seem, is an association, even obsession, between adult life and sexuality, and a growing gulf between childhood as something special and different and sexuality. So Mr. Morrison, Dr. Morrison, wants to break down the barrier between sexuality and childhood. He's saying childhood is not special and different when it comes to sexuality. Hawkes agrees, identifying that arguably it is the attitudes to children and sexuality where tensions and anxieties, as well as the contradictions of modernist sexuality, are most evident. She confirms that the construction of children as being both asexual and sexually corruptible, both innocent and dangerously impure, means that superficially the response to these doubts and fears was the separation of sexuality from childhood, accomplished through what Foucault has called the pedagogization of children's sex, and that finally the monitoring and controlling of the distressing presence of sexual nature was to be accomplished through the attention of medical experts, and more indirectly through legal frameworks which distinguish children as a separate category. So he's saying sexuality and childhood have been deemed incompatible, wrongly, he says, and this has resulted in his view, misguided and unnecessary attempts to control it, including age of consent laws. So what he's saying here, it seems pretty clear to me, is saying abolish the age of consent. Now, any paedophile reading this would be thinking, I'm on your wavelength. I like what you're saying here, Colin. So, Michel Foucault, that's quite a long section on him in his dissertation. He just quoted him approvingly there. Let's just read a bit about him from Wikipedia. Michel Foucault claimed that perhaps children could consent to sex, defended or promoted the practice of sex with minors, signed a 1977 petition to the French Parliament calling for the decriminalisation of all consensual sexual relations between adults and minors below the age of 15, the age of consent in France. Okay, back to Colin. The idea of children as separate creates challenges, particularly if human capability theory influences the way in which we construct learning opportunities. Human capability approaches, and indeed notions of sexual rights, encourage us to see learning about entitlements to good reproductive health, to freedom from sexual violence, to love, to sexual satisfaction as appropriate elements of a curriculum for all learners. Okay, human capability and rights. In other words, the same for all. No distinction. As has been saying, distinctions between children and adults are bad when it comes to sexuality. So if we focus on human capability and rights, that abolishes these distinctions. So they've got a right to good reproductive health. That means abortion. A right to sexual love. I mean, what on earth does that mean? The right to sexual satisfaction. So children need to be taught that they have the right to sexual satisfaction. Now he then finishes by saying, particularly where learning can be viewed as enhancing outcomes for children and young people in later life. Now it strikes me that what he's doing there is he's thinking, I better be careful, I better cover my back. I'll try and make it look like I only mean they're supposed to do these things when they're adults, despite the fact that he's been saying that making that sort of distinction between adults and children is unnecessary and wrong. So his message is we need to get over the old-fashioned oppressive idea that primary school children should not be exploring their sexuality and entering into romantic and sexually intimate relationships with other children and adults. Now perhaps Dr. Morrison would like to say at this point, oh, that's not what I meant, that's not what I meant, but it's pretty clear that that is what he was saying. Now just imagine if you were writing this PhD, if your topic was breaking down the barrier between childhood and sexuality, you'd be pretty worried about writing that, wouldn't you? You'd want to be really careful to absolutely nail it down, what you do and don't mean by it. You would be really worried that it might sound like a justification for paedophilia. But Colin Morrison, he didn't seem to have those concerns at all. Just one last quote from him. The historical perspective taken has affirmed the usefulness of an approach which dissociates our understanding of sexuality and the need for positive sexual health from a morality based on fear and ignorance to one based on dignity and social justice. Morality based on fear and ignorance, I wonder what moral system that could be. That would obviously be the traditional Christian understanding, shared pretty well by other world religions as well. In fact, just the traditional moral system of Western society. So he wants to throw that all overboard for his brave new world of progressive values. Education Scotland, John Swinney, they think Colin Morrison is the man for the job. He's the man who should be given control of sex education to produce resources to promote his philosophy to your children throughout Scotland. Okay, the SNP is rotten to the core. The opposition parties are useless. They wouldn't even begin to think about this sort of issue. So if you want to make a difference and fight back against this sort of degeneracy, then join the Scottish Family Party. There's a link below. You could sign up right now.